5 months earlier, China had signaled that it was willing to partially reopen its market to Japanese seafood. Then, only a short while ago, a cargo ship delivered 6 tons of Japanese scallops, the first batch allowed into China since the 2023 ban on Japan's aquatic exports. Japan expected to send another 4 tons within the following 2 months, and Japanese fishermen believed they were finally on the path to regaining their most important foreign market. But just as optimism began to rise, Japan took an action that once again provoked Beijing. In response, China abruptly cut off all channels for Japanese seafood. The renewed hope among Japanese exporters vanished instantly, and losses quickly climbed beyond $500 million. Less than 150 days separated the reopening announcement and the new shutdown. What unfolded in that short period, and why did China once again decide to halt Japanese seafood imports entirely? Japan, surrounded by ocean on all sides, is a classic maritime nation. Its coastline features extensive continental shelves, sheltered bays, and groups of islands that support rich marine ecosystems, making the country ideal for fisheries and aquaculture. Japan has long taken advantage of these natural conditions, earning global recognition for products like its salmon and scallops. More than 120,000 Japanese workers rely on seafood-related export industries, and each worker contributes roughly $82,000 in fishery output. Many Japanese companies had ambitious plans to expand, mainly because China, right next door, is one of the world's most powerful seafood-consuming markets. In 2022, Japan exported around $2.4 billion worth of marine products, and China alone purchased about 22% of that total, equivalent to roughly $520 million. For years, China had been Japan's most important overseas buyer, giving Japanese companies confidence in their long-term growth. But everything changed abruptly. On August 24, 2023, Japan began releasing treated nuclear wastewater from the Fukushima Daiichi power plant into the Pacific Ocean, a move that shocked many countries. What made it more alarming was that this was not a single discharge but the start of repeated releases that would continue for decades. Despite persistent objections from China, Russia, North Korea, and several Pacific Island nations, Japan maintained that the release was safe and would not harm the marine environment. The issue, however, was that any potential impact would not be limited to Japan. It could affect the entire Pacific Rim. On the very same day the discharge began, China announced a complete ban on Japanese seafood imports. By 2024, Japanese seafood entering China dropped from 22% of Japan's exports to just 2%. And most of that remaining percentage consisted only of non-edible items, such as pearls and ornamental fish, worth about $40 million. Japanese companies tried to divert their seafood back into the domestic market, but Japan's demand was already saturated. Worse, the wastewater incident made even Japanese consumers more cautious about eating local seafood. Globally, the issue had become widely known, and although short-term tests showed no immediate danger, many people feared long-term consumption risks. Even Japan's Western partners were reluctant to absorb the surplus seafood. As a result, Japanese fishermen were hit the hardest, especially those dependent on Chinese buyers. Some saw their orders drop by 30–40% instantly, while others lost all business altogether. Many factories stopped expansion plans or moved operations. Warehouses filled with unsold scallops and sea cucumbers, and small companies collapsed rapidly. Some fishermen had no choice but to watch their products spoil with nowhere to send them. Although the Japanese government distributed large subsidies worth hundreds of billions of yen, the financial relief could not begin to replace the enormous Chinese market they had lost. Not until June of this year did the situation show any sign of improvement. China announced that imports from Japan could gradually resume, but only under strict conditions. Seafood from 10 high-risk regions, including Fukushima, would still be banned. Any company wishing to export to China had to comply with China's new, extremely stringent requirements. Even previously approved exporters were required to apply again. The new rules were far tougher than typical international standards. Any producer dealing with edible aquatic products needed separate approval for both farming and processing stages. Every shipment had to include 3 documents: a sanitary certificate, test results proving no radioactive contamination, and a certificate of origin. If a single document was missing, Chinese customs could reject the entire shipment. And if China discovered any problems, unsafe products or weak oversight from the Japanese side, it reserved the right to suspend imports again at any moment. China's cautious approach was not arbitrary. For 2 years, it had consistently conducted its own independent sampling and also reviewed monitoring data from the international community. After Japanese authorities excluded the 10 coastal zones that had been flagged for higher radiation concerns, scientific surveys showed that the rest of Japan's waters contained normal levels of radioactive substances. Both seawater and seafood tested from these remaining regions showed no signs of contamination that would threaten human health. Even with these reassuring findings, nearly 700 Japanese marine product exporters rushed to apply for permission to re-enter the Chinese market by mid-November. Yet only 3 of those applications were approved. Japan still managed to send out a small trial shipment, 6 tons of scallops, in early November, and fishermen were preparing a follow-up export of another 4 tons over the next few months. But before the fishing industry could regain momentum, China suddenly reinstated a complete freeze on all Japanese seafood imports, stopping the process before it had even begun. On November 19th, China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs publicly announced another full suspension of Japanese seafood. Their statement claimed that Japan had promised to provide certain technical documentation to ensure that exported seafood met China's quality and safety standards. According to the ministry, Japan had not delivered these required materials, and because of this gap, China decided it needed to continue closely watching Japan's handling of the Fukushima wastewater discharge. On paper, the explanation sounded logical. Food safety is a major domestic issue for China. And of course, no country wants contaminated imports. But the timing and surrounding events suggested that this was not the whole story. Just a little over a week before this announcement, a political event ignited tensions. On November 7th, Japan's newly inaugurated Prime Minister, Saiteki, made a bold statement during a parliamentary debate. She argued that if China were to use force against Taiwan in a way that endangered Japan, the situation could be categorized as one threatening Japan's survival. Under Japan's security legislation, such a scenario would give Japan the legal basis to engage in collective self-defense, meaning that Japan could intervene militarily in a Taiwan Strait conflict. This directly touched China's core sovereignty interests, an area where Beijing has always held a firm stance. China's reaction was immediate. Its Ministry of Foreign Affairs demanded that the Japanese Prime Minister retract her statement and issue an apology. Instead of doing so, she repeated similar remarks publicly multiple times in the following days, which China interpreted as deliberate provocation. Tensions rose sharply. Soon after, China escalated its response by shutting down Japanese seafood imports entirely, a decision that carried both diplomatic weight and economic consequences. But the impact did not stop at seafood. Japan's tourism sector, historically dependent on Chinese visitors due to Japan's close proximity, quickly found itself facing severe losses. Chinese tourists typically contribute massive spending power, around 10.8 billion USD in 2024 alone, making them Japan's top source of tourism revenue. By September of the current year, Chinese visitors had already spent over 10 billion USD. However, following the Prime Minister's remarks, several Chinese airlines rapidly introduced free cancellation and rebooking options for all flights to Japan. Within a matter of days, nearly 500,000 airline tickets from China to Japan were cancelled, and many travel agencies froze their Japan-related tour packages. Under normal circumstances, the spring cherry blossom season fills Japan with Chinese tourists, especially around Kyoto, Tokyo, and Mount Fuji. But with current trends, it appears that the coming spring might be unusually quiet, with blossoms admired mostly by local residents. This collective consumer action from China dealt a powerful economic blow to Japan. The stock prices of companies tied to tourism, aviation, entertainment, and hospitality quickly declined. Even major tourist attractions and international entertainment brands operating in Japan, like Disney, saw shares fall by more than 7%. The nationwide economic effect was visible. In less than a week, Japan's GDP fell by approximately 0.36 percentage points. Despite Japan sending delegations to China in hopes of discussing tourism cooperation, talks have brought little concrete progress. While seafood and tourism were widely discussed, another sector unexpectedly became entangled in the situation: Japanese beef. However, the issue with beef stretches back more than 2 decades. In 2001, Japan reported its first case of mad cow disease. China responded swiftly, imposing a total ban on Japanese beef and beef-related products to prevent the disease from spreading into its domestic food chain. At that time, China implemented similar restrictions on the United Kingdom and several European Union countries for the same reason. For Japanese cattle farmers, the ban meant that one of the world's largest markets was suddenly closed to them. It took years of negotiation for Japan to make progress. Finally, in November 2019, China and Japan signed a major agreement on animal health and quarantine cooperation. Japanese media celebrated it as a breakthrough, predicting that the Chinese market would soon reopen to Japanese beef. More recently, in July of this year, Agricultural officials from both countries met in Beijing and agreed to accelerate efforts to bring the agreement into force. For Japan's livestock industry, hope was beginning to return, but that hope faded quickly. Because of the Japanese Prime Minister's recent comments regarding the Taiwan Strait situation, the fragile progress collapsed. The path for Japanese beef to re-enter China, a path that took more than 2 decades of negotiation, has once again been blocked. As usual, it is not politicians who pay the price, but the ordinary farmers, exporters, small business owners, and rural families who rely on these industries for their livelihoods. If you want to stay updated on future topics, analyses, and upcoming content, don't forget to subscribe and enable notifications. Much more is coming soon.